Okay. So this is a diagram for your book that shows the 3 major things that have to happen during urine formation. So remember that blood has to go in to the glomerulus, and the glomerulus is that specialized capillary bed, so it's a filtration membrane. So you'll see here that this is where filtrate is formed up here on number 1. Okay. And then the filtrate then goes into the tubules, and the first tubule is what? Called what? Proximal, right, or the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule. And you'll notice that there is a process here, which is called reabsorption. So students, oftentimes I've discovered, students get reabsorption and secretion backwards. So you'll notice here that the stuff that gets into the filtrate, a lot of it, actually like 65% of it, is actually reabsorbed here. And so that takes some energy, and so we'll talk about that. Some of that is active transport, where we have to use energy to put it back into the circulation, because that's stuff that we do not want to lose. And then secretion is stuff that is still in the blood, did not come out during filtration, and it has to be put back into the nephron so that it can leave the kidney and go into the bladder, okay? So you need to know, we're going to talk about, we already kind of talked about glomerular filtration and how it is regulated, right? So we're going to talk about tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion today. Okay, so when we look at reabsorption, and spelled that right? I spelled that wrong. No, that's right. Is that right? No. It's with a P or a B? B. Reabsorption. Okay, it just looked weird up there. Okay, so this is where, from the filtrate in the nephron, it goes back into the peritubular capillaries. So this is in the blood. Okay, so it goes in that direction. So if we look at the first part of where reabsorption takes place, it's in the proximal convoluted tubule. So you can abbreviate that as PCT, Chelsea. Okay. And so this is where the majority of reabsorption takes place.
Are you recording right now?
I am. You know, I think this is a P, isn't it? Reabsorption? Reabsorption? I think it is. Sorry. Absorption takes place.
Look it up.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm pretty sure.
It does look kind of weird.
It looks weird to me. I think that's a P, reabsorption. Because when I just spelled it without thinking about it, a P came out. Oh my gosh, I'm talking about P today. Yeah, okay. Okay, so water is one thing that gets reabsorbed. And this water movement is said to be facultative. Oops, sorry, not facultative, obligatory. So this is not facultative. So if you think, if you are obliged to do stuff, you have to do it, right? And so obligatory means that it occurs no matter what. So it doesn't depend upon whether or not you're trying to conserve water or whether you're trying to get rid of excess water that you've taken in. It always gets reabsorbed here. So facultative, we're going to talk about that. That is where, for example, if you're out in the desert and you don't drink water, your body is going to conserve water. So more water is going to be reabsorbed, and that does not take place in the PCT, but rather that takes place later on in the collecting ducts. And we'll talk about the antidiuretic hormone that accommodates that type of water conservation. Okay. Also, we have glucose. And so we have nutrients, and glucose is a really important one because this has to travel via active transport. So it is reabsorbed via active transport. So active transport takes a protein, right? It's in the plasma membrane of the cells that line the PCT. You saw when we looked at the kidney histology in lab, you saw that that is simple cuboidal tissue, so they're cube-shaped cells. And then it also asked you, why do those cube-shaped cells have so many mitochondria in them? And so the correct answer is this, is that they have to use energy to pump and to reabsorb some substances. So it uses ATP, right? Now, in order for this to happen, you also have to have carrier proteins. Right? So let's say that you are hyperglycemic. Does anybody remember what that means? Too much glucose in your blood, right? So if you have too much glucose in your blood, what is going to happen is that you are going to overwhelm the ability of the proximal convoluted tubule to reabsorb the glucose. And so it's going to try to get it all out, but it's not going to be able to. And so what is the if it can't get it all out of the filtrate, what happens? Not yet. If it can't get the glucose out, you're going to urinate glucose out, right? So you're going to have glucose in your urine. Okay, so like in lab, when we tested that, that means that your blood sugar levels were too high and your body was not able to reabsorb it. One of the reasons why people who are diabetic have renal failure is because they tend to have really high blood pressure due to extra solutes in their blood. And so they have more blood volume, and so they can actually damage their kidney. And so when they damage their kidneys, they can go into renal failure. And that means that they accumulate nitrogenous waste in their blood, and that is toxic, and that can lead to shutting down of other organs, and it can lead to a person going into coma, okay? So this is a sign of diabetes mellitus. So there's actually another type of diabetes which we've already talked about previously, but I'll mention it again. So mellitus, this actually means honey. And so the reference here is that the urine is sweet, right? So I guess in the previous physicians actually had to taste the urine of their patients to determine that it was sweet tasting urine, okay? Okay, so if we look at a diagram that shows this, this is an example. So most of that volume of the filtrate gets reabsorbed here. So we talked about water, we talked about glucose, but there are other essential nutrients that also have to be taken up, like amino acids, okay? And also sodium and bicarbonate ions. So we'll write that down too. Okay. So just continuing on here, amino acids. We don't want to lose amino acids in our urine. You can test the urine for protein, and that's a bad sign if there's protein in the urine. Okay. And also bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3 with a negative. So these are bicarbonate ions. Okay, so this is reabsorption, but there's also some secretion that takes place here. Oh, I forgot to mention sodium, sorry. Sodium ions. That'll be important in a little bit. So we also have secretion taking place. And so if we look at that diagram that shows the movement of substances, if substances come back in, right? So in this particular instance, some drugs, I think it's penicillin, you can get rid of in your urine. So some drugs that you take, you can test your urine to see if there's any drugs in there. Some drugs leave something in there that they can test for. And then we have sodium and ammonia. And so not sodium, we have hydrogen ions. And so this is one mechanism by which the body can regulate pH. So if there's too much hydrogen ions in the blood, hydrogen ions can go from the blood into the filtrate, okay? So let's go back and show the direction of secretion. So this is where, when we look at secretion, we go from the blood back to the filtrate, So hydrogen ions are secreted, and this helps to regulate blood pH. So when we look at the pH of the urine, it is very variable, right? So you notice that you could see differences in the pH. Urine, the pH is about 6, so it is slightly acidic, okay? But if you take in and you metabolize a lot of acids, and so proteins are known, like if you eat a lot of meat, that's known to produce ketone bodies, which are acidic, and that can raise the pH, or excuse me, lower the pH of your blood, so that you have to get rid of some hydrogen ions in your urine. So it can be low, so it could be, if you're getting rid, if you're secreting a lot, it could be about 4.5, right? So sometimes your urine is acidic. So sometimes when babies urinate, or when little kids pee themselves, it'll actually burn their skin if their urine is acidic, right? So sometimes the pH, the urine can actually burn because of its acidity.
Like you don't change the diaper glass?
Right, so that could cause, so if it's real acidic and it sits there for a while, it can cause sores. So yes, you can get sores from that. It could also be due to bacteria also that are present. But remember that urine, however, is not, is sterile. So it doesn't have any, should not have any bacteria in it. Okay. Okay, so the next part of the nephron, if we look at here, this is the loop of Henle. And remember that we talked about 2 different types of nephrons, and some of them are called cortical nephrons, so they have short loops of Henle, and some of them are called juxtamedullary nephrons, and so they have these long loops of Henle that extend down into the medulla of the kidney. Okay, so let's look at the loop of Henle. So we have what is called the descending limb. So this goes from the proximal convoluted tubule, and it's going to go descending into the medulla, and it has a thin segment. So if we look at segment, so it has a thin segment. So if we looked at the loop of Henle, you see that it goes from being pretty wide to being skinny. And this is where we have water reabsorption. So it's permeable to water, but impermeable to salt, and that's important. So it's permeable to water, impermeable to salt. So sodium and chloride cannot move across. So as it is going down, water is drawn out via osmosis. So water is drawn out into the intracellular fluid, or intracellular fluid, intracellular fluid via osmosis. And so the significant thing about this is it doesn't take energy. And would this be facultative or obligatory, do you think?
Obligatory.
Obligatory, right? So this is obligatory. So it has to happen, and it moves out because the solute concentration outside the loop of Henle increases as you move down the length of the nephron. So if we look at a diagram of this, this is my loop of Henle. This is my thin segment right here. Okay. Now, if you look at outside, so this would be the intracellular fluid, right? So this would be the fluid that surrounds the loop of Henle. And you'll notice that as it goes down, right, it becomes more concentrated. And that concentration is called osmolality. So the osmolality is increases as you move from the cortex to the medulla. Okay, so just know that osmolality is the concentration of solutes. So this 1200 is much more concentrated than the 300, right? And so what's going to happen is that water always moves with its concentration gradients, so it's just going to be sucked out. So we're going to get water moving out, okay? So it gets reabsorbed. So what that does is that sets up kind of a concentration gradient so that when we come up here, salt is going to move out instead of water. So in the ascending limb, this is the one that's moving towards the cortex. So it's moving back up towards the cortex. This is called the thick segments, right? So it's a thick segment. It is permeable to salt, but not water. So what is going to happen in that segment is that salt is going to move out because it is going to move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So salt moves out. What this whole loop of Henle is thought to do is it's thought to, as the salt moves out, it's going to maintain that concentration gradient. And so when we get to the collecting duct, that is going to be really important because that is going to what allows us when we overhydrate or when we're underhydrated to adjust the movement of water, okay? So if we look at a diagram here, okay, so this is the thick segments. Salt gets pushed out here, okay? And then what you'll notice is that as we move back up, we see that the salt comes out here, but it also is actively transported. So I should mention that. So whenever you see this red, that actually means that it's actively transported out. So when we get to the top, it's going to be actively transported. Okay, so the blue is passive, red is active.
So it's against the concentration gradient?
Yeah, so when it gets up to here, notice that in the medulla, it's at 400, no, it's at 600, is that right? Oh yeah, so it's less concentrated here. Here, it should be more concentrated on the outside. So here, the inside is 700 and the outside is 900. So salt is going to move out. Here, well, it's still different. Let me think about this for a second. If salt is at a higher concentration outside, it's not going to want to move. Yeah, so it is moving with against its concentration gradient because it is a lower concentration inside and a higher concentration outside. So yes, it's moving against its concentration gradient. Okay, so then if we look at what happens in the next one, so just ignore that, we'll talk about the DCT. So the next part is the distal convoluted tubule. And so in the distal convoluted tubule, we have some secretion occurring as well. And so when we look at secretion here, we can have potassium. So potassium could be in the filtrate, and we know what is potassium particularly important for? Nerve impulses, and what else? Clotting, blood clotting is also really important. Well, no, that's vitamin K, sorry. Ugh.
Yeah.
Potassium, I think potassium is important in it too, though, blood clotting. I'm not sure, but it is important in nerve regulation. Okay. So if we look at the distal convoluted tubule, where's my distal convoluted? Oh, it's right here, I'm sorry. Go back a few images. Okay. So potassium, okay, is secreted back in. We have sodium moving out. So you want to write that down in your PCT. Sodium moves out. And when sodium moves out, chloride follows. And then we can also have calcium reabsorption. So obviously calcium is important in blood clotting. It's also important of the function of the nerves, of the neurons as well. Okay, so I have a little video that shows this graphically, but it might be helpful to see the graphic version of it. So let me just get the video up here.
The renal system consists of the kidneys, the connecting arteries and veins, and the urinary tract. The kidneys are paired, bean-shaped organs lying outside the peritoneal cavity in the back of the upper abdomen, one on each side of the vertebral column. The kidneys function as the body's main excretory organs, eliminating the body's metabolic waste products by filtering the blood. Substances that are unneeded or are present in excess are filtered out of the blood and form into urine, moving via the ureter into the bladder before being expelled through the urethra. The kidneys also selectively reabsorb those substances that are needed to maintain the normal composition of the blood. By adjusting blood composition, the kidneys are able to maintain blood volume and pressure, ensure the proper balance of sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, hydrogen, phosphate, and pH, and eliminate products of metabolism such as urea, uric acid, and creatinine. The medial border of the kidney is indented by a deep fissure called the hilus, where the blood vessels, nerves, and ureters connect to the kidney. The kidney is composed of up to 18 lobes. Each lobe is composed of nephrons. Nephrons are the functional units of the kidney, and each kidney contains more than 1 million nephrons. Each nephron consists of a glomerulus and a system of tubules. The glomerulus is a unique high-pressure mass of capillaries that filters the blood. The glomerulus is encased in a thin, double-walled capsule called Bowman's capsule. The space inside the capsule and surrounding the glomerulus is called Bowman's space. Plasma-like fluid is filtered from the capillary blood into Bowman's space through the glomerular filtration membrane. The glomerular filtration membrane consists of 3 layers of capillary wall: the endothelium, the basement membrane, and the epithelium. This membrane allows some particles from the blood to pass through, but not all. The fluid that is filtered from the capillary blood into the Bowman's space is called filtrate and forms the primary urine. The filtrate then diffuses across Bowman's space and into the tubule system of the nephron. In the tubules, some substances are added to the filtrate as part of the urine formation, and some substances are reabsorbed out of the filtrate and back into the blood. The nephron tubule is divided into 4 segments. The filtrate passes through each of these segments before reaching the ureter, a highly coiled segment called the proximal convoluted tubule, which drains Bowman's capsule and where almost complete absorption of nutritionally important substances takes place. A thin loop structure called the loop of Henle, which reabsorbs water and ions from the urine and plays a role in controlling the concentration of urine. A distal coiled portion called the distal convoluted tubule, which regulates potassium, sodium, and pH, and where further dilution of the urine takes place. And the collecting tubule, which joins with several tubules to collect the filtrate and where final sodium regulation takes place. Each kidney is supplied with blood by a single renal artery that arises on its respective side of the aorta, before dividing into 5 segmental arteries that enter the hilus. Within the kidney, each segmental artery branches into several lobular arteries. The lobular arteries further subdivide to form interlobular arteries, which branch off into afferent arterioles. Blood flows into the glomeruli through the afferent arterioles. Blood flows out of the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. The afferent and efferent arterioles regulate glomerular capillary pressure by selectively dilating or constricting. The kidney's venous blood, now filtered, flows from the glomerulus via the efferent arterioles into the peritubular capillary network, a low-pressure, reabsorptive system surrounding all portions of the tubules. This arrangement permits rapid movement of solutes and water between the fluid in the tubular lumen and the blood in the capillaries. The peritubular capillaries rejoin to form the venous channels by which blood leaves the kidneys and empties into the inferior vena cava. Urine formation involves the filtration of the blood by the glomerulus to form an ultrafiltrate of urine, the tubular reabsorption of electrolytes and nutrients needed to maintain the constancy of the internal environment, and the secretion of waste materials. Filtration occurs as blood flows into the glomerulus from its afferent arteriole, and plasma moves through the glomerular capillaries into Bowman's space. From Bowman's space, the glomerular filtrate moves into the tubular segments of the nephron. Here, through tubular reabsorption, electrolytes and nutrients move from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. Here also, through tubular secretion, substances move from the peritubular capillaries into the urine filtrate. The filtrate concentrates in the collecting tubules, then finds its way to the renal pelvis, where it is directed to the ureter, the bladder, and the urethra for elimination. The kidneys perform an excretory function by filtering the blood and then selectively reabsorbing those materials that are needed to maintain a stable internal environment. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney and is composed of a glomerulus, which filters the blood, and a tubular component, where necessary substances are reabsorbed into the bloodstream and unneeded materials are secreted into the tubular filtrate for elimination in urine. Kidneys are able to maintain.
Okay, are there any questions about that? Okay, so let's talk about what happens when you get over or you're underhydrated. Okay, so this determines the concentration of the urine. When we look at urine, it is about 95% water, and it's about 5% solutes. So from the lab, how did we measure how many solutes or how much solute was in the urine? Remember? Yeah, the floating thing, right? So we used a hydrometer to measure the solute concentration, because if there's more solutes, it actually causes the hydrometer to float up, right? So you can measure using a hydrometer. Right? They actually measure, if you're interested, they measure other things like alcohol content in beer. You can use a hydrometer to do that. So the change in the amount of sugar that is converted to alcohol will change the specific gravity to measure. So this is called the specific gravity. Okay, so some things that are in the urine, some solutes that we have to get rid of are urea. The color of the urine is called urochrome. So this is actually a pigment derived from hemoglobin. So in general, your urine tends to be should be light yellow in color because of that. Although there are some chemicals like that found in beets. Sometimes if you eat a lot of beets, your urine will be pinkish in color. So that kind of can be confusing because you might think that you have blood in your urine, but that's just a pink pigment in the beets. Okay, we also have creatinine, and we can have uric acid. So the creatinine and the uric acid and the urea, these are all what we would refer to as nitrogenous wastes. And these are toxic if they build up in the blood. So we need to regulate the amount of solute concentration in the blood. And so we have a renal mechanism for maintaining blood solute concentrations. Okay. So let's start with the thing that you looked at in lab, which was the case study. So we had overhydration, for example, in a person that drank too much water. Okay. So if you drink too much water, you can actually dilute your blood to the point where it can actually cause you to die, right? So if you overhydrate, then the solute concentration decreases. And specifically, like the sodium concentration and the potassium concentration can shut down the nervous system, right? And that can lead to coma. So in this particular instance, you would want to produce, your body needs to produce, so you need to produce lots of dilute urine. So that is a mechanism by which you can get rid of the extra water that you have taken into your body. Okay. So if we have underhydration, right, the solute concentrations increase in the blood. So in that particular instance, you need to produce little concentrated urine. Right? So you're conserving water. So there is a hormone that aids in the regulation of solute concentrations, and it is called the antidiuretic hormone. And does anybody remember what endocrine gland produces the antidiuretic hormone? In the middle of your brain, sticking down from your hypothalamus? Pituitary, right? So it's actually the posterior pituitary gland. So that's where it's stored. It's actually produced by the hypothalamus, but it's stored in the posterior pituitary gland. It is released. And because it's a hormone, it goes via the circulatory system to the kidneys. And it actually has an effect on the kidneys. So it causes water channels called aquaporins. And these are proteins that create channels in the plasma membrane of the cells to be inserted into the walls of the collecting duct.
Causes proteins?
Water channels, those aquaporins, those are proteins.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. To be inserted into the walls of the collecting ducts. And so this is where we have what is referred to as facultative water absorption. right? And this water reabsorption is actually due to the solute concentration that was established by those long loops of Henle. Okay? So osmosis pulls the water out. Right? Due to the high external solute concentrations. So if you think about that word, what does diuresis mean? To produce lots of urine, right? So antidiuretic means that you are going to produce a little bit of urine and it's going to be highly concentrated. So an antidiuretic drug or whatever would help you retain water. Whereas if you were going to take a diuretic, and we take in diuretics like in the form of caffeine or vitamin C or alcohol, those are all examples of diuretics, that would mean that you would lose a lot of water. Okay. But ADH is only produced when solute concentrations in the blood get high and they're detected by the nervous system, and they cause ADH to be released. So if we look at an example here, okay, this is when, right, ADH is released, right? So the osmolality of the extracellular fluids increases, ADH is released, and then the aquaporins get kind of put into here, right? And it draws the water out so that the resulting urine that goes into the renal pelvis and then out to the bladders is really concentrated. So you can see here the concentration is 1200, right, versus being really dilute. So you can tell whether or not your urine is really concentrated oftentimes by looking at its color, right? So if it's like a bright yellow, except if you've taken B vitamins. So B vitamins actually make your urine yellow because you get rid of the B vitamins that color through your urine. But if you have really dark colored urine, it is oftentimes a sign that you are underhydrated, right? That you need to drink more water so that you can produce more dilute urine. Okay. So the opposite happens. So notice the water is drawn out, but the opposite happens if we have no ADH. So when we're overhydrated, notice that the concentration is 100. So it's much more dilute, right? Water is not drawn out. It would be drawn out if there were pores that would allow the water to leave, but there's no pores because there's no ADH. And so what we get is a large volume of dilute urine. Okay. Okay, so when we look at the ability of the kidney to do its job, sometimes we talk about renal clearance. And so this just is a measure of how well the kidneys work. And I forgot what the name of this was. There's a chemical that you were looking. Does anybody know what they look when they're determining? I think it starts with an I. Inulin clearance. I have to look it up. Okay. So what they would do is they give you a chemical called inulin. And inulin is not reabsorbed and it's not secreted. So it's not something that the body can actually take, right? So inulin is given. So this is a chemical put into the blood. And they look at the rate. They measure the rate at which it leaves the body via the urine. So you can have what is called renal disease if your blood, if your output is not very high, and your glomerular filtration rate is very low. And so remember I talked about how normally we produce about 1.8 liters of urine. In renal disease, we can have anuria, right? So this is where you're not producing enough urine. And this is less than 50 mils per day. So remember I said normal was about 1.8 liters per day.
Of urine?
Yeah.
So it'd be 5 point, it would be 5, like just be 5 liters a day instead of, or sorry, 0.5 liters a day.
0.5, let's see, if it's 50, we'd have to go back 3.05 liters. Is that right?
Isn't it 3 or?
Is it 2?
I think it's, we should know. We do this all the freaking.
Yeah,
I think it's,
0.5?
I think it's
It's in the
0.0.
chart.
I think it's 2.
Okay, I'll look it up.
It's not 1.8. Maybe it's 3, not 1.2. Doesn't that seem like really little?
It does seem like a little.
super little.
So just 50 mils, 2 liters, 0.05. So that's 0.05. Yeah.
0.05.
So what this means is that your blood is becoming toxic, right? Because you're not able to get rid of this. And this can be due to your glomerular filtration rate being too high or actually too low. And it could be due to damage to the filtration membrane, and the kidney kind of starts to shut down. And so there is a mechanism to filter the blood mechanically. And so we can do what is called dialysis treatment. So in this particular instance, the blood is removed from the body and put through a machine. And we actually looked at that filter, I think we took cell biology with me, because that was the dialysis tubing that we created the artificial cells with. And the dialysis tubing behaves very much like the cells in that it allows water to move out, and then you get the concentrated substances inside the machine. And so if we look at an image of this, I think this is not in your book, but this just shows the dialysis tubing, and it goes through the system. This is the dialysis fluid, right? And it helps to draw the water back out. And it helps to concentrate the waste products so that the blood that comes back into the body has been cleared of all of those waste products that cause damage to the body.
Is it like taking plasma when you donate plasma?
No. If you're taking plasma, blood plasma?
Like, you know, when you donate your blood and they like take it out of the machine and they shake it.
No, so that is taking out the blood cells. So the blood plasma is removing the blood cells and they centrifuge it. So this is taking it and putting it through a system that draws out all the waste products.
Isn't there something they do at home? They like, remember that? No?
Peritoneal dialysis.
Peritoneal dialysis. Like,
They put like the tube through your abdomen and it filters that way.
So it just filters your...
Yeah, it like uses your like peritoneal fluid or something and
Huh.
it filters it.
Oh, interesting. And that's for kidney failure?
yeah, I think it's just like.
Yeah, you can do
diffusion thing.
hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. But you can do that at home, but you can't do this at home yet.
No,
Right.
You have to do that like once a day, and you have to do this once a week.
Okay. That's interesting. I'll look that up. Okay, so this is why, for example, in people that have diabetes, they can sometimes damage their kidneys to the point where they don't work because of the kidneys are having to work so hard to get rid of the glucose, but also the blood pressure is so high. that oftentimes you see in populations where you have lots of diabetes. You see dialysis clinics, right? We have one out on the reservation where people go and get their blood cleaned using that. You can also get viruses and also other things that can attack the kidney. So it's not necessarily due to diabetes and other problems. Okay. So we actually already talked about urine, so I'm going to skip over that. Okay, so let's talk about the bladder. So remember that the pathway of urine coming in, it goes into the collecting ducts, and then it goes to the renal pelvis, right? And then it leaves via the ureter. And there's actually one ureter for each of the two kidneys. And from the ureter, it goes to the bladder. So the bladder can fill up and can store urine. Okay. And does anybody know what type of muscle allows the bladder to contract during urination? What type of muscle do you think that would be? Would it be smooth, skeletal, or cardiac? Smooth muscle. So the smooth muscle has stretch receptors. And so the stretch receptors can detect when your bladder is getting full, and they can send it to the nervous system, and you can actually have reflexive urination, and that's what happens with babies, right? So this just becomes a reflex, right? So the reflex seen in babies. But in order for the bladder to release its contents, there's actually an intrinsic sphincter and actually an extrinsic sphincter, and they both have to open up simultaneously. And so we get to the point where we can learn to control the external sphincter. So even if the bladder contracts, we don't urinate, right? And so let's look at a diagram that shows the structures. So this would be the bladder, and this is actually a male, because I see here's the prostate gland, and then the urethra is very long and going out through the penis. So the ureters come in right here. Actually, oops, they come in down here. This is the weird thing. I would think, and I actually had kidney problems when I was younger. And so notice how the ureters come in really way down low. And they were telling me that if I continue to have infections that would go up into my kidneys, it could possibly lead to kidney failure. That what they wanted to do is take those ureters and they wanted to move them to the top, because it's less likely that you're going to get urine buildup and back up into those ureters, and then urine with bacteria getting up into the kidneys if that was the case. Okay. So they kind of come down really low, and then this is the opening to the urethra. And this is the internal sphincter right there. And then we have an external sphincter, and the external sphincter is actually your pelvic floor. So they recommend that if you have problems with incontinence, which is sometimes happens when you get older or after females have babies, sometimes they have problems with incontinence, that you contract that muscular floor and do exercises to make that muscular floor less likely to open up when you, like, for example, when you cough or when you laugh, you know, you don't want to pee your pants when you're laughing, right? So you can strengthen that external urethral orifice, okay? So we have the internal urethral sphincter, and then the external, I'll just put urethral sphincter, right? And the external one is the pelvic floor muscles. Okay, So you would strengthen these to avoid incontinence.
And it's spelled with a K, not with a C. For all of those that think that that's what my last name is.
Oh.
I get made, well, got made fun of in.
Kegel exercises. Okay.
Yeah, but it's pronounced Kegel and it's
Right.
spelled with a K. Just in case anybody was
Good thing
curious.
to help.
Yeah, high school was interesting. And then my first name's Lakin, so it's even
Kegel.
more.
Is it Kegel like this? Kegel?
It's K-A-G, yeah, that's right. Because
You
my
would
last
know.
name is C-A-G-L-E.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there might be an E in there. Kegel?
Yeah, there might be.
Kegel exercises. Okay, so if we look at the mechanisms, when we open these sphincters, we actually have to have the parasympathetic nervous system helping to open them up. So in order for urination or micturition to occur, the parasympathetic nervous system has to be dominant, because we talked about the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So let me just, okay. So this is the fancy word for urination. So micturition. Urination. Okay. So we have to have an increase in the parasympathetic reflexes. And a subsequent decrease in sympathetic. Okay. We can voluntarily, in most cases, control the external sphincter but not internal or bladder contraction. So the really interesting thing about urination is that when you feel like you have to pee, that's your bladder contracting. And so it's sensing that it is being stretched by the volume of urine in your bladder. And so you're like, oh, I have to pee, but you don't let anything come out. And then after a while, you're like, oh, I don't have to pee. So it's like, just think about something else for a minute, right? And then you're like, oh, I don't have to pee. And so what that means is that your bladder has stopped contracting. So when you urinate, when you sit down, your bladder contracts. You can also help it contract by kind of forcing it to dispel by using your abdominal muscles, right? And then when it'll contract with the parasympathetic nervous system, and then you open the external sphincter, and then you can urinate, right, on control.
So if you have an increase in sympathetic, like in your sympathetic nervous system, like if you're in like a really stressful, high stress situation.
Yeah, so it's kind of weird because generally when you're stressed out, so let's say you're going into a job interview.
You have to pee beforehand, but once you get in, you don't.
Yeah, so maybe it's you can't pee.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to pee in that situation. But then there's the people that get so frightened that they lose control of their bladder and then they pee their pants.
It's kind of like sympathetic puking.
Override.
You see it, you
Too
smell it, you
excessive.
hear it, your stomach hurts.
Yeah.
It's all mental.
Okay, so this is actually controlled by the pons. And this is that part of the brainstem. So there's actually some neurons that control storing urine, and then there's some neurons that will send a signal out and will cause urine to be expelled from the bladder. And so in your book, there's this diagram that shows this, right? So here's the simple reflex. So you get your bladder wall stretches, right? And it sends it to the spinal cord. You increase the parasympathetic, decrease sympathetic, and then you can, that muscle, that pelvic floor muscle, which is called the detrusor muscle, contracts. the internal sphincter opens, and then you have urination. Right? So that's babies, right? They just will urinate, and they have no control over it. But in us, we have the ability to allow or inhibit it, and then we also have the pons being part of the central nervous system that's involuntary, that also allows us to open the external sphincter, right, when we're ready to urinate, and that would cause micturition. Okay. This right here shows what happens when we're stressed out. And so if we're stressed out, we could have too much sympathetic activity, and then we would not be able to urinate. Okay. Now, one problem is that when we can't urinate, and if we look at the males, so we can actually hold urine, and we look at the male, one problem is that you see this gland right here, that is the prostate gland. So rather than incontinence, we could have the problem of urine retention. So this is where you retain urine, right? One possibility is that in males, this can be due to an enlarged prostate gland. Right? So that's really annoying because you have to pee really bad and you can't. And so this becomes closed off, or maybe it would take a long time. So it takes them a long time to pee, and only a little bit comes out at a time, right? And so that's a problem that is typically seen in older males. And sometimes they'll actually go in there and they will enlarge this opening so that urine can more easily flow out. We also have problems with general anesthesia. So general anesthetics, right, inhibit urination. So oftentimes they will put in a catheter. Okay. And so the catheter bypasses the problem of the sphincters. So it's a tube that would go up, and it opens up those sphincters so that they can just drain the urine directly out, and you don't have to open or close those sphincters in order to allow the urine to leave the body. It's a very weird sensation having a catheter put in. For a female, I can imagine what it would be like for a male. Has any of you guys had catheters put in?
I know there's a balloon in there that they inflate and
To help open it up?
seen somebody rip it out.
Oh my God.
Ouch.
I've only seen it.
Wait, so it goes in through the.
Yeah, so it has to go up and in. In a female, it's a much shorter pathway, right? So in a female, it's a short catheter that would have to go in through. This is my external sphincter, my internal sphincter.
When you give birth, you have to put a catheter in?
Generally not, unless you get a C-section, and then they want to make sure that you're getting rid of the urine so that it doesn't, what they don't want is urine backing up into your kidneys.
They like numb it.
For a catheter? I don't think so. No. Yeah. So notice that the urethra, right, that's the next pathway. So from the bladder, the urine leaves via the urethra. So from the bladder, right, we have the urethra, okay, and then out of body. So don't get urethra and ureters mixed up. So the ureters carry urine to the bladder, the urethra carries it out, and in the females, the urethra is short. And the opening is close to the vagina. And the anus. Okay. So that's why you have to be very careful when you're wiping yourself to wipe yourself correctly in order to keep bacteria from getting up into the urethra, because once it gets into this, you can get a UTI or a urinary tract infection. So you can, as a problem, because urinary tract infections are much more common in females than in males. And then you get a bladder infection. And then the worst can happen is it gets the bacteria get up into your kidneys, and then your kidneys will shut down after a while being infected. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today, and then we are going to start on chapter 26 on Wednesday after we take the quiz.